While I was exceedingly busy with managing the hotel, Babe was home with two little children and had her mother, Ray, helping her. Uh, but she seemed quite content. In the summertime, we would have usually a few children over the age of 4 or 5, and they would eat in the tea room for lunch at 12 o'clock noon. And when our kids got to be 3 or 4 or older, they would join the other children in the tea room, and there would be a counselor supervising the kids. I imagine that my children uh, felt uh, somewhat out of it because they were practicing there to eat like an adult so that when they got to be 5 or 6 years old, they could finally make it to the family table in the big dining room. Uh, I imagine it was difficult for them, but it was certainly an incentive to eat in a mannerly way and learn to use the proper utensils uh, and learn to eat with other people. At any rate, uh, this continued for a couple of years until they finally got to be about 5 or 6 years old and were ready to eat at the family table. The family table would consist of uh, Babe and I and my Aunt Rebecca, who was still the owner of the hotel, and occasionally my mother and father would join us. Uh, I imagine that for Sheila and Bob, this was quite an occasion to have reached the pinnacle where they could leave the children's dining room and eat with the grown-ups. Uh, in the meantime, they were uh, growing up, both very cute, both very smart, uh, doing okay at school. As a matter of fact, Sheila was quite brilliant in her understanding of math and arithmetic. We used to play games with multiplying and multiplying and adding. And when she was about 6 years old, I introduced the subject at home of dealing with mixed fractions. And it didn't take her long to get the idea of how to operate with them. Uh, for instance, if you had a third, 1/3, and you wanted to add it to a half, that's kind of difficult. How do you do that? Well, you have to find the lowest common denominator, which in that case was 6, and a third would be 2/6, and a half would be 3/6. So a third and a half would be 5/6. Uh, that's a difficult concept for a child to understand, but it didn't take Sheila very long to follow that. Uh, I was amazed, really, at her ability. Uh, both of them were doing very well, and we were happy with them. Uh, we usually took our vacations in January, right after Christmas and New Year's, the hotel would be practically empty, and we could go away for a couple of weeks without missing any business. And being January, we would usually go to someplace warm like Mexico or the Caribbean, and we made many visits to Puerto Rico and Mexico, and occasionally to the Virgin Islands. We liked the American Virgin Islands very much because there was tennis and beautiful swimming and nice place for us to go in the cold month of January. I don't think that our children liked our going too much because it meant that they had to stay with Grandma Ray, and she was pretty strict with them, and it wasn't a lot of fun. But at the same time, we felt that that time of year school was going on and that they shouldn't miss 2 weeks, and we also would probably enjoy our vacation a little more without a couple of little kids going with us. Sometimes Ray and the kids moved into the hotel and took 2 rooms which were empty anyway, and stayed there rather than traveling back and forth from our house, which was a mile from the hotel. We wrote to each other, and they scribbled some little notes to us to stay in touch during those 2 weeks that we were away. Babe was busy with her jewelry business, which was doing well and growing, and she got a big kick out of that because she was in charge, and she didn't have to answer to anybody. And she was a big shot at the hotel, having a jewelry store, and important in the city, visiting dealers that she would buy things from. So it was working out very well. We thought of our doing that because if she had not been in the jewelry business, she would have probably had one of the important positions at the hotel. And then if we wanted to take a vacation, there would be 2 holes in the management of the hotel, which would make our both leaving at the same time a problem. So this went on for a couple of years. The children, Bob and Sheila, would sometimes join in the summertime. They would join children guests at the hotel and a counselor who was supervising them, and they would play with these kids, and they were eating in the children's dining room with the other kids. And so they didn't feel that bad because they were probably a little younger than some of the kids, or the same age, because we didn't take guests children that were younger than 5. And so they fit in fine for a couple of years with those kids. While I was thinking about what I would be saying and talking about on this part of the conversation, I remembered that on one of my walks upstairs on the second and third floors to see how the chambermaids were doing in the morning, I saw a little black girl hanging around her mother's shins. It seems like one of the chambermaids we had was a Negro lady, and she didn't have any place to leave this little kid while she was working, so the kid came to work with her and hung around in the morning upstairs in the rooms as they were changing the linen and cleaning out the bedrooms. This is about 65 years ago, but that little kid's name came to my mind as I was taking a walk, and her name was Jezebel. When I mentioned her to Bob, he remembered and said, yeah, well, I used to play with her, and I think we called her Jessie, which makes some sense. When I saw her, I said, why don't you join the other kids and go swimming instead of hanging around here? And her mother said, would that be all right? I said, sure. So I took Jezebel, or Jessie, down to the lake where the other kids were in the pool and introduced her, and she was happy to get into the pool. Well, not the pool, but the shallow end of the lake where the kids would swim. I was very surprised that same day, later in the day, that one of our regular guests, the wife of a doctor, who spent all summer at the hotel and many vacations during the year, said to me, why did you do that? I said, do what? She said, bring Jezebel to swim in the lake. I said, what do you mean? She said, well, I think some of the parents of those children would not like to have a Negro child swimming in the lake with them. And I was dumbfounded. I mean, it never occurred to me that anybody would even have any feelings about it, but it showed me how color conscious a Jewish lady of about 50 or 60 years of age could be, thinking in some way that this little black girl could contaminate the water and not be palatable to the white kids, the other white kids that were swimming there. Another incident that occurred with these children was, as I was walking down to the lake one day, these kids had finished their swimming and were going up to lunch. It was getting close to noon, and they were going up to eat. And this little girl and I stopped to say hello. And when we finished, I said, are you going up to lunch? She said, yes, we're going, I'm hungry. I said, okay, fine, enjoy yourself, I'll see you later. And she stopped dead in her tracks, looked up at me and said, what's the matter? Can't you see me now? I thought that was one of the funniest things that happened to me. I later found out that this girl, even though her parents didn't know it, was hard of hearing. She was only 4 or 5 years old, but she just didn't hear well. And the fact that they learned about it meant that they could start to do something about improving her condition. I don't remember what the results were, but after watching her grow up, she seemed to be able to cope with her loss of hearing in a better way. Well, the big day finally came when our children were considered old enough and trained enough to eat with adults in the big dining room. And I must say they really were. They had been motivated to learn to eat properly so that they could make it to the big dining room. And I'm sure that it was a big occasion for them. It was great for Babe because she no longer had to cook dinners for them at home, and it was easy to take them to eat at the hotel. They behaved remarkably well, as we knew they would. They enjoyed eating there. They were grown up, with quotes around around the grown up, but they acted grown up, and we enjoyed having them, and they joined the discussions that went on at the table. And I think their Aunt Rebecca enjoyed having them around. Occasionally, after a while, Bob would invite a few of his friends from school to come and join him for dinner. And for these kids, it was a big occasion. One thing, eating in the dining room was something, but the other thing was they got a chance to ride in the elevator. And since this elevator was the only one in the town of Lake Mahopac, it was a pretty big deal. So Bob was a kind of big shot, showing them how to push the buttons, and they could ride up and down a few times and enjoy themselves. I think they also enjoyed eating dinner there. At any rate, after some time, one of the mothers of the boy, a good friend by the name of Lenny Shore, a good friend of Bob's, invited him to have dinner with them at their house, and his mother, Flo Shore, who was a school teacher, was going to entertain Bob at dinner. I wondered how that would go, and a couple of weeks later, I happened to meet Flo Shore at the checkout line at the Grand Union. The Grand Union was a large market store in town. At any rate, I said hello, and we chatted a minute, and I said, "You had Bob at your house for dinner. How did that go?" She said, "Oh, it was great. First of all, I never saw a kid with such manners. When I served them, he came behind me and pushed the chair in for me to make me comfortable at the table. His manners were impeccable." I said, "Wow, that sounds great." She said there was one thing that was a little unusual. I went, "Uh-oh." "What was that, Mrs. Shore?" She said, "When I put his dinner down in front of him, he said, 'What are the other choices?'" he didn't know that most people didn't have choices at meal times. Like the hotel, we always had three main dishes, and if you chose one, you didn't like one, you could choose from two others. But this was a little foreign to him. I think he was about 6 or 7 years old at the time, and didn't know that you didn't always have choices at dinner. Anyway, things were going pretty well at the hotel. The special weekends of singles weekends and bridge weekends were bringing in a lot of business, and wanted to continue with my project of changing the semi-private rooms with a bath in between, with a shower and toilet in between the two rooms, into rooms with private baths or private showers. And I figured out a way to do this with a cost of about $500. I could affect the change. But $500 was that was for each of the semi-private rooms, of which I had about 20 that I wanted to change to private baths. So I needed money for this. I needed cash, and one way I thought of getting some extra money was to create a subdivision on the land fronting on Kirk Lake, and put up about and arrange for a subdivision of 14 lots, which I figured would each be worth about $20,000 to $30,000. So any sales I made there would give me some cash to make the private baths that I was looking to add to the hotel. In the meantime, some good things were happening at the hotel because of guests who became friends, wanted to help me and themselves. One of these people was Abe Lipkins, who was a partner in Broadway Maintenance, a company that took care of the lighting system in several of the boroughs of New York City. They were a huge company making millions of dollars a year from these contracts. They had Brooklyn, Manhattan, and Queens to take care of. That's the lighting system of these boroughs that had hundreds, maybe thousands of lighting poles and lighting bulbs that they were had a contract to supervise and replace the bulbs and put up the poles as needed. Anyway, Abe Lipkins stayed at the hotel with his family for all summer vacations and occasionally during the winter. And he and his wife had an understanding to get a divorce, and he was giving her half of the money that he had in order to have her agree to the divorce. In that, I think it was $500,000 that he was giving her. In those days, a Cadillac cost $3,000 or $4,000. So when you're talking about $500,000, that was a great deal of money. He would be left with $500,000 plus his income from Broadway maintenance. And he had a small apartment besides his regular apartment, which was a huge one on Park Avenue, that his wife was going to get in as part of the terms of this divorce. But for the summer months, he thought he would like to spend those at the Forest House because he enjoyed being there so much. But he wanted a more comfortable setting than a room with a private bath at the hotel. And he asked me if he could take the boathouse and refinish it, rebuild it in effect, putting in a bedroom and living room and a huge sun deck, and use that as his abode. At the time, we didn't have any running water to the boathouse, so he proposed to put in a well that would provide the water and build a septic tank and field on the lawn to get rid of the effluent from his apartment. And he thought he would spend maybe 6 months up in Mahopac and the rest of the winter at his small apartment in the city. In order to make his living up there more comfortable, he proposed hiring a Korean young man to clean the place and keep it ready and serve liquor on the terrace that he was building and have hors d'oeuvres up there for his friends. Well, he asked if I would allow him to do it, and I said, I think that would be great. You pay me for the time you stay here to cover my expenses in the dining room, and he agreed to that. But what I was getting was a water fountain down at the lake, so that guests going down there could have some fresh water to drink. When I started at age 13 and a half, I had to carry a tank full of water to the lake every morning, and that was the water that people used, taking small cupfuls if they were thirsty in the summertime. Not only that, but he would add to the income that I was getting without my having to build anything. It was just a perfect situation. And he went ahead with a deal which I imagine in today's cost would probably be $150,000 or $200,000. In those days, for him, it was very little because he used Broadway maintenance employees to build and to build this and change the building at the lakefront. He had all the material that he needed. To dig up the waterfront where he would put in a septic tank and field, and he hired somebody to drill a well, and things worked out swimmingly. So that gave me additional income without any expense. At the same time, Jules Gerson, who had been spending his summers with his family, which consisted of a wife, a daughter, the daughter's husband, and a child, they had been spending their summers at the hotel, and he occupied 3 rooms, one for a private bath for himself and his wife, and 2 rooms for his children's family. And he asked me if he could take 2 of those rooms and make them more comfortable for him. And I said, well, I hate to give up 2 rooms like that, and what I'd like you to do is, if you could build an apartment for yourself on the roof of the hotel. And he thought that was a great idea. And since we had an elevator running up to the 3rd floor, it would be no problem to have his apartment up there. So we came to an agreement by which he built a 6-room apartment on the roof and signed a lease that he would pay a certain amount, and whether he was there or not, and not pay any extra when he or his family stayed at the hotel for the food that they would have. Anyway, this was a great addition. I had extra guests and no expense in building this apartment. So with all these things, well, first of all, the reason they were willing to invest as they were, Abe Lipkins and Jules Gerson, was because they liked staying at the hotel. They loved it. And they had faith that I would continue running the hotel the way they enjoyed it. And they had faith in me to remain friendly and take care of them so that they could enjoy the effects of the investment they were putting into the hotel. So this meant that our business was improving. We were doing fairly well. And when the kids were 11 and 13, we decided to go on a vacation, a 2-week vacation to St. Thomas. And we would spend a week in St. Thomas and a week on a sailboat called the Maverick that sailed around the British Virgin Islands. And we thought that would be a good vacation. I don't think we needed to ask the kids. This was probably sounded pretty good to them. And we agreed that we would do that in January. So the big moment came, and we flew to St. Thomas, and we had rented rooms at a hotel for the first week, and we spent that at visiting the town. Babe and I would play tennis in the afternoon, and every day we would spend a good part of the time at Morning Star Beach, which was delightful. The kids enjoyed running up and down the hill from the town, learning what the town of St. Thomas was like, and thoroughly enjoying themselves. When that week was over, we repaired to the docks and started to get onto this boat called the Maverick, which was docked in the port of St. Thomas. And there were 11 passengers, room for 11 passengers on this boat, plus the captain and his wife, who took care of the sailing and the cooking aboard the ship. The idea was that the 11 passengers would be going along for the ride, and the passengers would help as crew members and learn how to sail the boat. I noticed when we came aboard that the other 8 passengers looked askance at these 2 kids getting aboard, because they had hope of this being they were young, middle, I would say, in their 20s and 30s, and they didn't look forward to having children on the boat. So they weren't too happy about it, but it didn't take long, just a half a day or so, when they saw that these children were well behaved and wouldn't be a problem to them. Most of us stayed in bunks in the main cabin, and there was a head that was a shower and toilet off the bunk area, and there was one small stateroom or bedroom for Sheila, who was 13 and wouldn't have been comfortable sleeping in this room with 10 other people. And she had her own little head, her own bathroom and shower off this bedroom. Anyway, we started out, and we were going to the British Virgin Islands, and the plan was to dock at offshore from one island, go for a swim, and then after dinner, spend the time on the boat until we would go to sleep. The first island that we went to was St. John's, another of the American Virgin Islands that had an absolutely beautiful beach, and we had such fun cavorting in the sea there swimming off the boat. By the way, we didn't, as I recall now, there was no shower for us on that boat, and what we did was jump into the sea to wash us off in the salt water. That was fine. That was fine. The meals were very good. We had breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and there was a kind of a cocktail hour time, not for my kids, but for the rest of us, and there were rum drinks, and my kids were accepted absolutely wonderfully by the other 8 people. And when they found that they could swim and help out and not be a nuisance in any way, they were delighted with them. And the kids, of course, had a wonderful time. Each day we went after breakfast, when the wind came up, which was usually around 10 o'clock, we would sail to another island and explore it. We went to Norman Island, which was kind of interesting because that was our name. That was practically undeveloped and nobody there. We went to Joost van Dyke, where there was a shower, I recall, that we could use. We went to of course, Virgin Gorda, which was one of the principal attractions of this trip because of the rock formations. There were huge boulders that many thousands of years had been thrown on the beach and tangled with one another, and you could walk in between the spaces of these where they touched. As I recall, they were boulders of about 20 feet in diameter and occasionally touching one another, but in others there was space to walk through, and the waves would wash around them. It was just absolutely stunning. I wish I could do that now. But can you imagine for 11 and a 13-year-old boy and girl to have this opportunity? They were ecstatic. We continued for the week. The weather was great. We went from one island to another, and we all enjoyed learning how to sail, and the week flew by. But it certainly was a memorable vacation. And as we look backwards in life for 40, 50 years ago, it was an outstanding thing as part of our lives. And we are so glad that we had the opportunity to do it together.